Before we jump into this week's episode of Major Pain, I will remind you that I am not a medical professional. Please do not take any medical action based off what you hear on this podcast without first consulting your doctor.
I didn't know there was a whole community behind being chronically ill.
It doesn't just become a story of disability, because that's really a universal story.
We got to be strong. We have no choice but to be strong.
Welcome to Major Pain. I'm your host, Jesse Mercury, and this week I'm so excited to be joined by Katie from ThriveNinety. Katie, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for all the work that you do helping people in the community of individuals dealing with long-term conditions and lots of other health issues.
Well, thank you so much. That's so kind of you. Before we jump into our conversation today, I'd love to get to know both you and your organization a little bit. So, Katie, why don't you tell me about yourself?
So my name's Katie Brennan, and I'm an economist by training and have worked for a number of years in kind of policy work, doing work in the health sector in particular, and worked for the National Health Service in the UK. Probably tell my accent. I'm American by background, but I lived and worked in England for many years, and was very fortunate there to have been able to do some good policy work and work on healthcare improvement, very data-driven work, working with top clinicians to figure out where care could be offering better value, but also improving outcomes for patients, and kind of that sort of magical zone where interventions and changes to care could achieve both outcomes in terms of savings for the system, but more importantly, better experience and getting upstream of problems for people with complex needs. So that was, extremely rewarding work. And, I was very fortunate there to learn a lot about how bodies work, how they don't work, what happens when they don't work, and what can be done about it. I think I'm also sort of outside of the workspace. I'm a passionate skier and like to do sort of all things outdoors, hiking and all that other good stuff.
Awesome. Yeah. And tell me about ThriveNinety. What is your organization?
Yeah. So ThriveNinety, and I think that this is really bound up in my own, I guess, personal journey around recovery from long COVID. But it's an organization that I started with a friend and now colleague, Andrea Henkel Burke, who's actually a former Olympic champion and World Cup champion in the sport of biathlon, which is shooting and cross-country skiing. And we are all about supporting other people who are dealing with long COVID, long Lyme's, and other kind of post-infection chronic conditions. And ThriveNinety was kind of drawing on her background to a degree where, she, after her competitive career finished, she's really passionate about health and resilience for her own purposes, but also to support other people through their own journey. And she, was working as a personal trainer and kind of coach, and wanted to be skiing still when she was 90 years old. And so I loved that for a couple of reasons. One is because it just sounded like a great ambition, and it's all about thriving and continuing to thrive. And also from my own perspective, after I was impacted by long COVID, I really felt like my entire body was failing me. And, I was going to, I felt like I had a pretty short time horizon before I had even more serious health issues cropping up. And so that ambition about trying to get healthy and work on resilience and, still be skiing and doing things that you loved, well into 90 and beyond, just sounded like such an amazing goal and something to really embrace. So I think that was sort of where the name came from. And what the organization is about is, we have a web-based support program to help people who are looking to manage long COVID and other long-term conditions like that, and also, importantly, find their recovery path. And what we do is a little bit different because there's no medication involved, but it's all about supporting nervous system health and through movement, supporting brain-body connections. There's dietary elements to what we do to support gut health and the links between your gut and your nervous system and your gut and your brain and your gut and your immune system. So it's kind of all about using movement-based elements, nervous system resets, and diet and other things that are really accessible to people, even people with limited energy and mobility, so that they can start to help their body to self-regulate and reset and gain more energy, gain more ability, and start to repair and recover over time.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. And, very much aligned with how I feel about chronic illness recovery, you know, getting to the fundamentals of getting some movement in your body when it's so difficult to do so because you're probably in pain and probably have limited energy. Finding a way to get movement, for me, that was just like a critical piece. And in my journey, it was a wheelchair, and that shocked me, but it helped so much. And it, for different people, it's going to be a different thing. I'm excited to talk more about that. But before we do, I want to hear more about your story. You've alluded to this a little bit, but Katie, what is your major pain?
Yeah, so my major pain has definitely been long COVID. So I was, reasonably healthy and active. And then in March 2020, I was at the start of the pandemic. I was living and working in London, and we had just shifted from doing sort of strategy work in the health system to, on a dime, changing over to planning for the pandemic response. And so we were, I led a team of analysts, and, we shifted over to working out how many beds and how much oxygen was going to be needed and, where to put the field hospitals and, this kind of really scary stuff at the start of the pandemic when lots of people were ill and we didn't really know what we were facing or how long it would last. And at that time, I got sick. I was commuting in on the trains and public transport, and there was a lot of illness around. And I was sort of okay during the acute phase. I was definitely more sick than I normally would have been with a cold, and it felt like kind of a bad flu, and I had some breathing problems, but sat it out at home. I isolated from my husband and my little one, and so they fortunately didn't get sick, but I sort of was holed up in our spare room and still working for part of it, and felt okay and expected to just get better after a week or so, and unfortunately that never really happened. So I think after the acute phase kind of subsided, then I still found all of these kind of strange soup of symptoms and continuing health issues, like breathing difficulty, really elevated heart rate. My heart rate just kept spiking up, even if I was just sitting in front of my computer not doing anything. I had my pupils were dilated, which didn't make any sense at the time, but with the benefit of hindsight, it was a real clear signal that my nervous system was not aligned properly. But there was, and the fatigue and brain fog that everybody talks about were also something that I was wrestling with. And, I was very fortunate to be able to, still be functional enough to work, but I just didn't feel like myself. And I knew I wasn't operating at my best, by a long, long way. And I think, multitasking, doing stuff with the family, like everything was just way more challenging than it had been or that it should be.
Wow. And I mean, this sounds like it's right at the beginning of the pandemic, no vaccines yet. You're just one of the first people in the history of humanity to get COVID,
Yes. Yeah.
And it's so funny to think about now because we've come so far so fast with COVID where, like by the time I got COVID, Paxlovid already existed. And it's like and I'd already been vaccinated a couple times, but by the first time that I got COVID, and that it just, now you can get COVID, and for a lot of people, you can just get sick and then recover. But back in the beginning, that was not the case. And unfortunately, it's still not the case for certain individuals. And there's that element of sort of rolling the dice there, which is terrifying. But, this is just a whole different universe. And it's a thing we got to, put our minds back into that place of the beginning of the pandemic when we're washing our vegetables, when we bring them home from the grocery store, going for a jog outside and panicking when someone breathes that walks next to you. I mean, it's still just wild that we live through this. But I mean, here you are sort of on the front lines of trying to help people out. And in so doing, end up getting COVID yourself. What had your health been like prior to that? Have you had any health issues in the past? Any serious issues like, up until this moment where you get COVID?
Yeah, I really didn't, which was an interesting thing. I'd had, some sports injuries and, kind of dealt with those over time, but nothing in terms of longer term health issues. I think, with the benefit of looking back, I think I probably did have some, underlying very low level autoimmune that made issues that maybe made me more vulnerable. But I think at the time, my system was coping and I felt pretty healthy and I was, as I said, active, and I thought I ate pretty well, although I feel like that my view on that has changed for sure. So I think that it really kind of, hit me like a brick wall to suddenly no longer, be as vital and capable as I was used to being.
Yeah. And you're a wife and a mother, and all of a sudden your health just fundamentally changes. Yeah. It must have taken some time to sort of realize that was even happening, because you're just waiting to get better from COVID. And then that terror must have set in of, oh my God, I'm one of these people with this scary long COVID thing that they're talking about on the news. Can you tell me about that? I mean, do you remember, was there a moment when you realized what was happening?
For sure. And I think that, because I was in the kind of thick of a lot of the health system response from the start, there were definitely, I feel like I had a bit more exposure to clinicians and to data and evidence and conversations about what people were seeing on the ground. And, the kind of now and, the weird things that they were seeing in terms of, upticks in levels of strokes and heart attacks that supposedly had nothing to do with COVID. But, again, looking back, we see that, a lot of that is likely linked. Even though it wasn't getting kind of tagged or coded that way at the time, because people just didn't understand what was happening in people's bodies. But I think part of what I was doing immediately before the pandemic, I think, led to that aha moment that you're talking about, where we were trying to figure out sort of how to get upstream and how to support people with complex needs that were often maybe not diagnosed fully by the health system. So people with a mix of symptoms like pain, they might have a diagnosis of anxiety or depression, whether or not that was actually the case. They had that diagnosis, and they had issues with mobility, and they had a lot of issues with being immunocompromised, or being at risk for other longer term health issues. And one of the moments that really hit me was suddenly when having an awareness of what that kind of soup of autoimmune metabolic conditions sort of looked like, and suddenly being able to go through that list myself and tick a lot of them off. And it was I think, I'm not going to say fortunate, but I felt very lucky to have had a little bit of exposure to that in the locker, so that, in a way I could recognize it a little bit quicker, maybe. And then the downside is that I also knew the data and what it looked like in terms of, increased risk of early onset of some pretty serious health conditions. But I think it also became a great motivator for me to try to figure things out and control what I was able to control, to sort of, lessen the impact that was having on my system, and to feel better, day to day.
Yeah. And you must have also had to sort of very quickly start to adjust your lifestyle
Mm.
and figure out how to work with what amount of energy you were currently having.
Totally. And I have to say, I'm embarrassed to say that took me way longer than it should. So I think I was
Yeah.
probably, a year and a half in of sort of, saying, well, maybe if I just rest a little bit more, then, everything will just heal up and then I'll be able to get going. And then, being impatient with the resting and getting caught in that kind of push crash cycle
Hmm.
that a lot of people talk about, trying to overexert yourself because you just want to feel normal again. And then, ending up paying the price for that on the back end for a couple of days. And in my case, I was very fortunate that my crash cycle was really only about 24 hours. So I could afford to
Mm.
push it a little bit. And I know that that's not the case for everybody, but again, I felt a little bit lucky on that end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
But then I think, I started to feel like a little bit better. Actually moved back to the US with my family. Got a new job, which was a whole nother challenge. And then I actually got COVID for a second time.
Oh, no.
And, that's when any small gains that I'd had eroded. The brain fog was worse than I ever experienced. The fatigue ratcheted up to another level. I
Mm.
just didn't have the resilience to cope. And, that was when it really, really hit me. I knew that I was experiencing, post-COVID impacts before, but I think I felt, very non-functional suddenly. And, I couldn't sort of multitask, or if my daughter was talking to me, I couldn't focus on, doing anything in the kitchen or really doing anything else. And at this point, my daughter was 2. So if you can imagine,
Mm.
the patience of a curious 2-year-old can be, lovely and overwhelming all at the same time. But when you're also dealing with, memory and cognitive issues, and, it got way too much for me really quickly. And, it wasn't where I wanted to be. It wasn't the type of parent I wanted to be able to be and the experience that I wanted her to have. And it's not what I wanted for myself. So I think at that moment, I really decided to change things up. And I stepped back from my professional role and started to really focus on health, and dove into research and epidemiological studies, and and the long COVID community, which is amazing and so knowledgeable and supportive. And kind of figured out that combination from some of the work I'd done in the health service, other pathways that were working for diseases and conditions as disparate as, anxiety, depression, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, autoimmune issues, and, kind of re-earthing some of those, some of that work that I'd had exposure to before, and marrying that up with some of the new emerging information coming out in the long COVID space,
Mm.
both from an academic side and from a lived experience side.
Wow. Yeah.
Um,
And what did you discover? Did you start to implement things into your own life, and did that start to help?
yeah, for sure. And I think, yeah, I started off at focusing in on the nervous system a little bit. And I know that now we know dysautonomia is a really big thing and affects a lot of people in the long COVID space, as well as sort of other long-term conditions. But that was a big one. And, I as sort of jumping in place, I just said, let's pretend this is a nervous system issue, and started focusing on my vagus nerve and tangible things that I could do to help support regulating the nervous system and the vagus nerve functioning. And that really started to move the dial, which was incredible, and
Mm.
gave me so much hope. And as I did that, I started to feel better, and I started to improve to the point where I could actually go and do more activity, had more energy, and my brain was less fuzzy, and I felt well enough to go to an exercise class that my other friends had been raving about. And after I moved back to the US, and said, you have to go to this.
Mm.
And, I went. I was very nervous because I hadn't done that much physical activity. But I knew that I could also just kind of step down and ratchet that work down, as much as I needed to pace appropriately. And, fortunately, this is where I met Andrea, who was leading the class. And it was this amazing combination of, I would say, a little bit strenuous, but not over the top, kind of physical conditioning. But in and amongst it all, she sprinkled in an incredible amount of work around mobility to support brain-body connections, nervous system work, eye movements, breathing, and really took this toolkit that I started to play around with, but it was taking it, up to the next level and then some. And so after a few weeks of going to this class every Monday morning, I really started to feel the benefit. And it felt like it was accelerating my recovery, even more than I was already experiencing. And I had coffee with Andrea and showed up with a whole stack of books, research. She must have thought that, I was mad, but fortunately it piqued her interest rather than frightened her off. And, I just said, there's so much behind what you're doing, which she knew from her studies. And she's actually, a certified practitioner of what's called PNI, which is psychoneuroimmunology, which is all about all of these, how your systems link together. And so has been able to be very deliberate about those tools and exercises and activities to kind of nudge your system into better functioning. And so I think she was really game. I think she hadn't appreciated the scale of need in the post-infection chronic condition space, and was really up for getting our heads together and trying to put together a program that was, available, that was web-based so that people didn't need to travel and could conserve their energy, and that was gentle enough and accessible enough so that people with these chronic conditions and with fatigue issues and this whole suite of symptoms could still do and benefit from this kind of curated set of tools.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned psychoneural immunology.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of like emotional and intellectual impacts on the immune system. Is that what that is?
Sort of. It's actually a lot more like kind of physical and physiologically based, but it's about your brain-body connections, and it's about how your nervous system and your gut and your brain all connect up, and how those things can be positively impacted by mobility and what you do in terms of like moving your joints, and how that sends communication and clears out signals and pathways between your brain and body. And to some degree, there's elements of it that I think certainly people who do a lot of yoga would recognize and feel. But I think the difference is that the focus is more honed in on the very specific, gentle movements that deliver the biggest impact and really target those connections specifically and support regulation and support recovery in your body. So if you think about people often experiencing long COVID, kind of get stuck, their nervous system gets stuck in fight or flight mode is part of the challenge. And that means, this is very simplistic, but effectively it means that they find it difficult to switch into the rest and repair state. And so it's one of the reasons why these issues kind of persist, is it's like multi-system issues, and everything is a little bit out of kilter, and they're all linked. All your systems are linked to each other. So that kind of natural self-regulation mode doesn't get switched on as easily. And so you kind of need something to kickstart that. And a lot of these movements do just that. And what's super fun is that, you can do them at the start of the day, and you can do them throughout the day as well, and there's cumulative benefits. So, I think that a lot of a lot of that has been great. And Andrea first came into that and sort of, found these tools as a wellness, longevity, resilience sort of option from that kind of high-end professional sport performance space. And, she will always say one of the most important things when you're a high-end athlete isn't so much your training, although that's important, but it's actually what you do to recover in between your sessions so that you can train well.
Yeah.
And I love that framing. And I think that when you sort of think about that and the small margins between you being on the podium and being in the pack that they were kind of managing, and how important it was to do those recovery elements well to be able to, make it on the podium and keep your spot on the team and meet your goals. So much of what she describes as her professional sporting career, really looks and feels an awful lot like what people managing long-term conditions do.
Yeah.
Which is so surprising. It's like,
Yeah.
you are operating at an Olympic level. Congratulations. All of the things around pacing and around diet and, supporting, reduced inflammation through foods and other things. And crucially, allowing for these, sharp brain body connections just to make, the movements that you're doing more easy and to let your body flow in as seamless a way as you can, so that you can get every little inch out of your ability and performance. And when, certainly I found that, every little like centimeter of additional performance really made a huge difference when I was struggling. So anything
Mm.
that could help was helpful and actually supported me to be able to do more, allowed my body to get more comfortable with doing more slowly over time, and, kind of created this virtuous cycle of healing and repair and symptom management, which, I'm eternally grateful for.
Yeah, that's so interesting. What an interesting dichotomy. There's a couple things here that sort of feel like they are fundamentally at odds, but they are not. They are one. This idea that an Olympic athlete and a person with a chronic illness are sort of fighting the same fight, where it's you're trying to get every inch of what your body is capable of out. And when you have a chronic illness, that is exactly what it is like when you are on the couch, when you have no energy and you're trying to find anything that you can do that'll kickstart some sort of energy production in your body and get you off the couch. The fact that the same tools that might help an Olympic athlete who is trying to recover their body to get every inch out of performance, the fact that those are the same tools, that absolutely makes sense. That is so cool and so interesting. And also, the other thing that I think is so important, another thing that is sort of sounds like it's fundamentally at odds, is this idea that when you are so exhausted and it feels like what you need is rest, sometimes in those moments, what you need is movement. And this is something that I experience all the time. And actually, I just had a really interesting experience with it this week, where I've been sort of doing too much and needing more rest time. And after I gave myself the rest time that I needed, I did some physical activity that was a little bit more than what I've been doing recently. I went for a jog for the first time in a really long time, and I felt better for days after. It's like something about it sort of released this well of energy production that was sort of stuck and not happening because I was, my daily life, my job, walking right up to that edge of what I was capable of every day. And that was like wearing me down. And what I needed was extra rest and then extra activity, which surprised me. I really, there's a mind-body connection thing happening here. I'm just so interested and so fascinated by the mind-body connection because I spent so much time asking my body, what is wrong? What is wrong? Before getting a diagnosis. And it was telling me every day, there's a system, there's a function, there is a fundamental problem here and we need to fix it. And my body doesn't have words to give me to tell me mast cell activation syndrome. I needed a doctor to do that. But it was telling me every day anyway in its own words. And when I started trying to listen to it and do what it was asking me to do, it's sort of like these aha moments, one after the other, of like, wow, you've been screaming this at me for years and I have not heard you. And finally getting the tools to hear your own body and to sort of act in accordance to what it wants you to do is such a powerful experience. It sounds to me like you and Andrea are sort of building a program to help people get in touch with that, which is really, really exciting. I'd love to hear more about that. What does that look like? What is the physicality of these movements that you're recommending? What is the diet involved? I'd love to hear all about it.
Yeah, great. I think you've absolutely nailed it. That really tough call that comes in with pacing, about that mix between activity and rest. And I think I certainly for a long time was thinking about pacing as rest or the lack of activity. And, I think that when when you have like a conventional injury, like, you sprain your ankle or something like that, or you break a bone, you need to let the site heal. And then you progressively do more activity to deal with the deconditioning and to get back in shape. And I think the challenge with long-term conditions, like mast cell activation syndrome, like long COVID and long Lyme's, other things that people face, is that actually it's an ongoing systemic issue that you're facing. So just resting is not going to get your system back. That you need to actually nudge it back and you need to give it the inputs. And movement is actually a huge component, like you say, given the brain-body connection. And listening to your body to be able to pace correctly is so valuable. And again, I think this is where that experience from the professional sporting world is really valuable, because, people have, get places on teams, places on podiums, sponsorship deals, all in the balance. And so, it's really important to get that right. And
oh man. Oh yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that pressure, that external pressure to perform with your body, that's a lot. Yeah. Oh my God. Wow.
Yeah. And obviously it's like, they're hugely driven because that's why they're there in the first place, is from the passion for being there in the sport that they love. But, when you're operating, at that next level, there's a whole other sort of aspect to it. And, you've got to figure out ways to get it right. And I think that that pacing and listening to your body, and sometimes being able to push back on your coaches and say, no, my body is telling me I need this, to allow individuals to succeed and be successful is such an important skill. And I think a lot of the people, and Andrea will say, a lot of the people who maybe aren't able to reach their full potential are people who just bulldoze through and, don't listen to their bodies and, train too hard almost, and don't get that benefit of the optimal training. And I know that in the community of people kind of dealing with long-term conditions, that's so much, where people land is, that sense of, oh, like no pain, no gain. I have to just push myself. It's just this. And I think a lot of that is reinforced in a way that's not very helpful sometimes by people around us who love us, completely, but just have a hard time understanding what it is and what our body needs. And so to your point about really tapping into your symptoms and using those symptoms as your body being your friend, your best friend, and talking to you, and, is a total game changer as part of this. And, I think also just the emotional framing of it is so powerful, that instead of just thinking like, why is my body failing me? This is miserable. Will I ever feel normal again? It's just saying, okay, like I'm being spoken to here. What do I need to do to listen and adjust?
Yeah, I'm sure I've shared this at some point in the history of the podcast, but I had a sort of breakthrough moment with my mind-body connection years and years ago when I was, still like really in the midst of my mystery illness. I had this dog, Miles, who was my best friend for 17 years. And I really felt like Miles and I were communicating. Obviously, Miles can't speak English and was not talking to me with words, but I knew when he was hungry. I knew when he was sick. I knew when he was unhappy. I knew when he was anxious. And I knew when he was excited. I knew all of that. It was just extremely obvious to me. And Miles was my best friend. So Miles and I had that relationship, that nonverbal best friend relationship. And I think this might have happened after Miles passed, but I had a breakthrough. It's like, what if I approach my body like it was my dog,
Yes.
Like, what if my body was a nonverbal best friend, that I love and understand and listen to and can speak to me and can tell me what it wants. And it was a real breakthrough moment for me because I realized in that moment, I had been ignoring it. Because my body was screaming at me all the time, like all these really loud, really uncomfortable things that I didn't want to hear, because it's so hard to depersonalize that because it is you. It is a part of the system that is you. And I didn't want it to be in pain, and I didn't want to hear that. But that's not the choice that I had. The choice that I had was whether or not to listen. And when I approached it externally, as if it were my best friend, like Miles, like my dog, it really made a difference with me being able to hear and interpret and take action based off of the messages that my body was sending me.
So true. And, it's amazing that, like you say, your body doesn't have the language. And so what it throws up are pain and
exactly.
fuzzy brain and, all these kind of disparate things, which are really a protective response, which again, I think is so powerful to think about, that it's like your body doesn't want you to get into more trouble because it's trying to deal with something that you're dealing with already and get your systems back into balance. So please don't add to this. I'm going to throw out things that make you slow down. It's a little bit like, if you have any, substances in your system, or, you have poison or something like that, it definitely just, slows down your cognition, slows down your motor patterns. Everything becomes a little bit more difficult just to try to get you to do what it needs you to do, which is, listen and not get yourself into any more trouble for the time being.
Totally.
And it's such again, it's amazing when you do that. And I think it also allows you, once you tap in, and, part of what we do in the program is sort of, I think, threefold. One is we support people to know and guide them through some of the movement-based elements that help to reset the systems, improve clarity of brain-body connections, and, those communication loops, stand down that fight or flight sort of fear response, and allow people to move with greater ease and less energy, which is amazing in and of itself. But then there's also that pacing component and helping to tap into the signals so that you can do more without pushing things too far. Because I guess that's the other thing that I really learned, and I'm sure you've had this experience where, you could go for a run or maybe do something, mental activity, physical activity for a very short amount of time at a really light pace. But it was really hard to know when enough was enough until you had the crash, and then it was too late to do anything.
Yeah.
So the trick was like, how do you get ahead of that and figure out when is the moment that you have to back off so that you can still benefit from the movement and the activity, but know when your body is sending you those little micro taps on the shoulder to say, okay, now it's time to back off.
How do you know? I still am trying to figure that out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some really great work done in the space around concussion and traumatic brain injury that can be looked at in terms of like heart rate and that kind of thing, but also just getting really, really tuned into your signals can be so powerful. And I know from my own experience, and just as an example, I could run for 8 minutes at what I run, I'm saying this like, it was like plodding along, barely a jog,
Yeah.
but it was 8 minutes. And if I did more than 8 minutes, then I would crash. And I knew that. And then the challenge is how do I, at that point, my heart rate would spike, I would start to get, headache, or my vision would get a bit blurry, or, I just wouldn't be as sharp on my feet. And so what I was able to do was I stayed underneath that threshold for, to make sure, and this is where the nervous system comes in, is trying to, support the nervous system to gain ability and improve your energy levels overall, while you act to not overtax your system, which allows you to stay in that rest and repair state for longer, which then has the positive benefits there. So you're trying to like ride that line and not tip your system into fight or flight as much as possible.
Yeah, and that sounds like a great way to do it, is sort of like trial and error. 8 minutes. If I go beyond 8 minutes, I flared up. If I went 8 minutes exactly, I didn't flare up the next day. That's one great way to do it. And I've been on some jogs where my wife was walking and I was the same speed, Yes,
totally.
And for me, letting go of ego has been a really important piece of this. Letting go of that piece of my brain that's telling me you need to push yourself in order to build strength. It's like, that's not what this is about. This is about getting the right amount of movement to not flare yourself up the next day. This is about working in harmony, working in concert with your body, not necessarily pushing your body. You're pushing your body just by doing the movement at all.
Totally. And I think that framing is incredible and such a game changer when you're thinking about, how to do things safely and actually do it with joy, which is the other component.
I love that. That's great.
That it's, you can get, you think about it differently. Your goals are different. And then you can kind of get that little dopamine hit from doing something that in the past you would have been frustrated by. And all of that, again, just helps to reinforce the kind of those positive feedback loops in your system. And, I think that the other component, I had that sort of timing in mind, but the other thing that allowed me to push that boundary out as my system started to reset and I felt healthier was tapping into the symptoms. And so I knew that, when my heart rate spiked above a certain level or I started to get a little fuzzy vision or my feet just started to get a little clumsy. So if I had a little, I caught my toe or something like that, those were all signals from my body, back to your point of your signals being your best friend and great communication from your body, that, that was a tap on the shoulder that told me I needed to back off. And then I needed to either walk or stop running. And pretty soon, doing that, I found that I was able to go longer. I was able to ratchet up the intensity. But the goal, to your point, was always to keep it underneath that kind of safety line. It wasn't about going for X amount of time or this amount of distance. It totally was about being mobile and being active. And I think the other thing that I learned so much from Andrea about was the value of low intensity activity, and that actually in their training for, big sporting competitions, so much of their training was that foundation building in zone 1, which is what they call it, which is like that really low intensity, conversational pace. And that so much of the benefit and your, the transformation that happens in your body system happens when you train at that lower intensity level. And then you do a few sessions, when you're working at the level that she was working at, obviously some higher intensity stuff. But when you're trying to reset your systems, staying in that zone 1 and that low intensity training delivers so many benefits of, from your metabolic system, as you say, brain body connections, that sense of safety, that extremely low intensity cardio is unbelievably helpful for everybody, but you get so much benefit from it. So I think that was a great bit of my education, and I think also helped to reframe that to say this is what people who are even really looking to push their bodies do, because this is what you need.
Yeah. So if someone were to go to, check out this web-based guidance at ThriveNinety, what sort of movements are we going to see? Is it like yoga sort of stuff? Is it, light jogging? Or I mean, what are the movements that we would see on your website?
So the movements, and there's some free samples available if people wanted to check out specifically just to test out to see how it works for them. But it's a combination of things like joint mobility. So, moving, tilting your ankles is one example, but also kind of, moving your shoulders in specific ways, or, isolating movements around your hips or your rib cage. And then there's also a lot of eye movements, because a huge amount of your cranial nerves are connected to the muscles around your eye. So that's a really great, very direct way to kind of get at that nervous system health and the brain-body connection elements. Also some breathing, because we know that's linked in, and then crucially diet. And we actually, we kind of couldn't get into everything that we needed to get into in the program. So we wrote a book that's a combination of kind of an informational guide around anti-inflammatory diet and nutrition, and then a cookbook with lots of recipes and things to kick you off. And so for me, it was, this was a sort of a new space, and I had a lot of discovery here. And so we've sort of tried to give a resource to kickstart people if they're curious about exploring that.
Yeah. And is there like a quick, easy way to sort of give a broad overview of what that anti-inflammatory diet looks like?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that the quick version is cutting out things that, that harm your gut, basically. So it's things like gluten, dairy, and sugar. And, some of this is about, cutting it out if that works for you, or just reducing it. And then the flip side of that is to, really up your intake of vegetables and, reducing processed foods. So eat fresh stuff, eat a lot of vegetables and fruits, meats like chicken and fish, and kind of proteins like beans and lentils that can offer, lower, reduced inflammation as opposed to red meats. And still give you the protein that you need. So I think a lot of that, that's kind of the short version, and healthy fats. But there's also some elements in there about you timing your food and giving yourself a little bit of a break between meals and snacking, because every time you take something in, your immune system has to investigate. So like 70 to 80% of your immune system is actually in your gut lining. So if you think about that, and think about the because it's kind of, outside of your body, almost like your intestinal tract doesn't really, it's through you, but it's not in you. And so
it's a pathway.
Yeah. So, so that lining of your intestinal wall is, a huge kind of interface between the outside world and your body. And so if you can do things to make that work less hard, and let your immune system, not have to continually cope with things, then that allows it to do other work in terms of healing and supporting your body. So I think there's some great examples there. And I think that, that list of gluten and dairy and sugar, trying to reduce those can seem a little daunting. I know for me, I was, a bread and pasta and cheese person completely.
That's the good stuff.
Yeah, exactly. But I have to say that, thinking about it a little bit differently, a bit like we were talking about with exercise, is a real game changer. In that actually it's about, trying to reduce the amount of processed foods, but just, buy stuff fresh and eat stuff that's fresh. And actually I eat so much better. I eat better tasting food now. And it doesn't take that much more time, and it's not that much more expensive, if at all, just to make fresh food that tastes really great. You do batches and have leftovers. And I haven't been impacted, by any issues with histamine buildup. And so, I definitely benefit from batch cooking and
Yes.
going from there.
I'm on the low histamine diet because of mast cell activation. And that's
Yeah.
that's the spot where I have to differ, is that I can't batch cook. I can't have leftovers because histamine grows in food over time.
Exactly. Yeah.
A huge portion of what you just described is exactly what my diet is. The low histamine diet. It's just like fresh food. And I have found that my taste buds have changed. The more that I limit, I've been gluten-free for over a decade at this point. And even recently, I've started to introduce just a small amount of gluten, because it's, like for me, the low histamine diet, keep the histamine low, but it's not zero, because that's not possible. You can't have a zero histamine diet. And I've been kind of asking my body the question, like, can I have, a bite of gluten once a week? And will that be okay? And so far, the answer has been yes. And I find that, that strict, regimented, you cannot eat this thing can sometimes have some harm. So allowing myself to open up just the slightest bit. And I've definitely gone too far and gotten sick. And I know that gluten is an inflammatory food, and I have a disease that causes inflammation. And I really, it's got to be minimal. But there's a big difference between minimal and zero. So that's something I'm personally experimenting with, that I've been enjoying recently. But like I was saying, my taste buds have changed. So my taste has changed. What I enjoy to eat has changed. And it's become more in line with this like fresh food, healthy stuff that I'm just now sort of loving in a way that I didn't when I first had to eat that way, because it just felt so restrictive and felt kind of like such a loss to give up on all these foods that I loved so much. But I found good substitutions that has really made a difference in my life. And I really kind of love it. And I think that as you eat this way, the anti-inflammatory diet, or for me, the low histamine diet, the benefit it's so big. The benefit is so big. And the amount of energy that my body is able to produce now that I couldn't before is so wonderful and joyful. And like you were saying, move with joy. I think eating with joy is really important too. And eating in this way that makes your body sort of hum like a happy machine has a benefit that goes beyond taste and flavor and satisfaction in the moment of eating. But then those things start to come over time. So you might, if you're trying to switch your diet, you might hate it at first, and you might not be satisfied by any meal that you're having. But over time, your taste buds will change. You will adapt. If you're lowering the amount of sugar, I think that's a big one that really changed my taste buds. And now I just sort of thrive on this healthy eating and love it in a way that I never would have anticipated.
Yeah, it's so true. And it happens fast too. I think, it's, taste buds can change kind of in only a couple of weeks, and, you can really start to feel it. But you're right to say that, the kind of, 80-20 rule, focus on the high impact things. And it's, this isn't a dogma. It's about knowledge and being able to make intentional choices.
Yeah.
But I think I love your point about once you find some decent substitutes, then you're off and running. And that was definitely the learning curve that I had. And I think one of the reasons why we wanted to put recipes in the guidance that we were pulling together for people we worked with, so that you had some really easy go-tos right off the bat. And, to your point about once you get used to this, it just becomes what you do. I mean, my daughter now asked for the muffins that I make for our family to bring to school for her birthday, as like her favorite muffins.
Wow, that's cool.
Which was great. And,
Love that.
and she loved them and wolfed them down. And I think all the rest of the kids hadn't quite adjusted their taste buds. But the fact that, I love teachers like them. But I think, I love the fact that she's, this knock-on benefit of that she is growing up, as someone not impacted by autoimmune issues, and touch wood, she won't have to deal with that at any point, but she might. And, regardless, she's growing up with the ability and the kind of the taste for, certainly very happy with Halloween candy and store-bought, cupcakes, but equally really appreciates, the kind of, no processed sugar foods and can very happily eat it all, which is great.
So you're about 5 years into this journey at this point of this long COVID journey. And
Yeah.
where are you now? I mean, you've obviously made so many changes. Everything we've just talked about, I'm assuming, is things
Mm.
that not only are you talking about on the Thrive90 site, but you're also, I'm assuming, applying to your own life. So
Yeah.
where are you now? How has this journey gone for you?
It's been amazing. I think it's one of those, like, if I could go back, would I do it again? I'm not sure it's been that amazing, but at the same time, I'm a different person now, and I kind of wouldn't change it at the same time.
Mhm.
It's been, I feel probably healthier than I was before,
Wow.
which
Whoa.
is amazing. I have to pay attention to things in a way that I didn't before. And,
Mhm.
I think my tolerance for alcohol has not come back.
Mhm.
That's one of those things. But, I think, I can live with that personally. And there's decent substitutes to your point. But I think that other than that, I have more energy. I'm more fit. I'm able to do more than I was. And I think the thing that I find amazing about the tools, and we kind of have a 12-unit online program where we take people through a whole range of tools so that they get lots of exposure, lots of different opportunity to kind of nudge different joints and different brain body connections and see which really have an impact for them, as well as to benefit from that variety of different ways of moving your body. And the thing that I find to be really impactful is that it's a great Kickstarter to accelerate recovery and start to manage symptoms. But given that a lot of these tools are the same thing that people who are, high performers physically utilize to support their own resilience and recovery, they're tools that I've continued to use and continued to kind of hit new heights,
Hmm.
which was such a surprise, but a delightful one. And so I use these movement tools regularly still, and I don't know where I'm going to land, but I already feel like I'm definitely more fit and healthy and capable, than I was before I got ill, which is a
Wow.
strange thing to say.
Yeah, that's shocking. It sounds like you're still monitoring and managing,
Hmm.
and it's
Definitely.
not like long COVID is gone, but you
Yeah.
have found tools that work that allow you to thrive in a way that is surprising even to you, which is so cool. Well, I have one more question for you.
Mhm.
So, thinking back to that day where you were looking at all of the symptoms of long COVID and then basically looking in a mirror and realizing this is me, that day where you realize that, you're not recovering from COVID, you are becoming one of these people that is going to have to deal with this forever. That's such a scary thing to think about. And I think that when we're in a moment like that, it's almost impossible to detach from the idea that this will be forever. It's like when you have a bad health day, it's like, oh, this is it. This is my health from now on. It's so
Yeah.
hard in those moments to remember that health is not linear, and then it goes up and down.
Mm.
Flare-ups come and go, and the way you feel in this moment is not reflective of every day for the rest of your life. It's so hard to forget that. But let's go back to that moment. If you could travel back in time and speak to yourself in that moment, the moment you realize that you have long COVID, what is the message from today that you'd want to give to yourself at that time?
Yeah, it's so important. And I think the kind of grief and sorrow that you feel in that moment is so deep and so painful. Like, just kind of thinking back to that myself. And I think that there's a couple of things. One is definitely that this isn't necessarily your life and doesn't have to be where you stay. And as you say, things aren't linear, and so there's some natural fluctuation, but also that it's possible to do things that are in your control and in your ability level to feel better, even in those moments, even when you're that unwell.
Hmm.
And, I think the encouragement to and kind of hope to control what you can control, to start to feel better, to eke out that X percentage of additional performance and ability, can be amazing in terms of just allowing you to go see that friend that you hadn't seen, or be able to, do some housework or engage with the family differently or work part-time or anything that you really are passionate about and will get a lot from that can actually end up giving you more energy. So, do what you can to control what you can control, really prioritize and think about the things that give you energy, and utilize those as a springboard to feel more confident and capable and have more energy after that to do things that you like. So find ways to kickstart that virtuous cycle, and also, don't worry about what people are telling you, and if there's uncertainty, including with your clinicians. And I'm not a doctor and I don't pretend to be, but there's a lot of great evidence-based solutions out there and available, and to start to tap into some of those, can be a real game changer.
Awesome. Well, Katie, please tell us where we can go if people want to check out ThriveNinety and the work that you and Andrea are doing.
Absolutely. So we have a website, ThriveNinety.com, and that's Thrive90, the word 90 all spelled out. And we're also on social media at Thrive90 through Facebook and Instagram. And we love hearing from people. We love being connected. And you can get our book on our website. It's also on Amazon, or feel free to reach out. We'd love to talk to people about our program or answer any questions. And on our website, we have the ability to check out a couple of some of these movement and mobility tools that we were talking about. And you can see how they work. There's 3 there, along with some self-assessments, so you get some real-time feedback about how they're impacting your system, and you can see if they might be something that works for you and feels right.
Awesome. Well, it's been so fun talking to you today. And these are topics that are so important, so personal to me. This idea of pacing and, thinking about the mind-body connection. This is stuff that I'm just so fascinated by. And it's just been really, really fun to connect with you and to hear your story today. Thank you so much for coming on Major Pain.
Yeah, thank you so much again for having me here. Like you say, these are such important things to talk about. And it's amazing to have a forum to reach out to people and make sure that everybody knows that they're not on their own and there's lots of options available.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening to this episode of Major Pain. I'm Jesse Mercury, your host and the producer of this podcast. Artwork by Egg Salad Salad. Our theme music is the song Time Machine from my synth-pop album Sci-Fi, now streaming everywhere. Support this show on social media, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook, all at Major Pain Podcast. If you have questions or comments you'd like to share with myself, our guests, or our listeners, send an email to majorpainpodcast@gmail.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about this show, support its creation, or comment on any episode at majorpainpodcast.com.